Really wishing I got a haircut before the quarantine. Okay. Horror legend H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West Re-animator was first released in February 1922 in Homebrew magazine. It was a serial release, spanning 6 issues, each one recounting a set of spooky events brought on by the narrator and his colleague, the titular Herbert West. West theorizes that because the human body is a complex, squishy machine, it can be started up again after death. The narrator meets West in college, and West convinces him to go help with the reanimation research. West has a mysterious serum that he's been developing, and all he needs is fresh corpses to test it on. So our narrator helps him rob graves and make changes to the serum. Their serum always ends up half working. They always bring someone back, but they return as half-human monsters. Screaming, clawing at their own coffin, eating human flesh, that sort of thing. West is convinced that, for the best results, he needs to inject the serum as soon as possible after death, to prevent decomposition from setting in. He becomes so obsessed with this theory that he ends up murdering a traveling salesman to get the freshest possible corpse. Which was probably legal back then. I imagine you could kill whoever you wanted in your own home in the 20s, but trying to bring him back to life was where he crossed the line. Each of the story's installments result in another one of their experiments going horribly wrong, ending in a grand finale where an army of their failed experiments have organized and tear West apart before disappearing into the night. The narrator, like most Lovecraft narrators, is left on the brink of sanity. This story is a bit of an anomaly when it comes to Lovecraft's work. You might notice that there is no mention of elder gods or otherworldly terrors. For an author best known for his cosmic horror stories, this work feels very grounded. It's a zombie story by way of Frankenstein. To be fair, this was really cutting-edge stuff 100 years ago. Zombies or the undead had existed in folklore all over the world, but this story helped shape that folklore into the crazed, flesh-eating zombies that we have in pop culture today. But it still feels off compared to his other works, and this is largely due to the structure of the story. Lovecraft had done serial releases in the past, but this time he was required to end each installment with a cliffhanger, which naturally meant that the story would need 6 different climaxes. And the only way to really do that was to have the characters make a zombie in a slightly different way 6 times. It's not his best work, and Lovecraft even admitted it. He didn't like the story very much, and he really just did it for the paycheck. But a lot of his usual style still remains. He's still on point when it comes to describing the monsters that Herbert West creates. Oh, and he's still super racist. Actually, I think this is the most racist story of his that I've read. In the 3rd installment of the series, Lovecraft turns his descriptive talents on a black boxer that West intends to reanimate, and the result is just awful to read through. I bring this up because, well, for one, it's really hard to talk about Lovecraft without bringing up his racism, but it can also help inform us on what kind of horror this story contains. Horror stories have a way of revealing what people were afraid of at the time they were made, both for the culture as a whole and for the creators themselves. So, what was a shut-in white dude afraid of in 1920s America? Well, black people, for starters. The Civil War was just 2 generations ago. He might also be afraid of technology. The 20s were following the Second Industrial Revolution and World War I. These events, along with the proliferation of the car and the radio, probably felt like a whirlwind of progress. And it's understandable that there were some fears of what science and technology could do. World War I had shown people just how destructive these technological advances could really be. This fear feels a bit more timeless, especially after watching the movie adaptation of Lovecraft's story. The film Reanimator was released in 1985 and is more of a spiritual adaptation than a faithful one. It's set in the modern day, or the modern day for 1985. It keeps many of the same elements of Lovecraft's original, but alters the plot enough to make it work in a film format. Honestly, I found the movie to be much more engaging. It just has a way of grabbing your attention.
Grover!
Er ist tot.
Herbert West is still a medical student, as is our narrator. Well, he isn't the narrator in this one, and his name is Dan. Sure enough, he meets West at Miskatonic University and gets wrapped up in his reanimation scheme.
Playing with pencils for fun?
We're playing with pencils for fun.
But there are some new factors thrown in. For one, the way West's serum is revealed to Dan is through West killing and attempting to reanimate Dan's cat. First, Dan discovers the cat's corpse in West's refrigerator, and somehow West is able to convince him that the cat was dead when he found it, and he wanted to make sure it didn't rot.
What happened? It was dead when I found it.
Dan is not a smart man. That night, he hears a ruckus in the basement and checks to see what's going on. West has brought the cat back to life, and the cat is pissed. I love the way this scene is handled. They were having to use a cat puppet in these scenes, so to minimize the amount of time you actually see their puppet, they just have our two characters chasing nothing around the room. Swing a lamp around, knock over some props, and add some audio of an angry cat, and suddenly our duo is chasing a zombie cat around the basement in a scene that's as funny as it is scary. It reminded me the most of chasing bugs around my room as a kid. I grew up in an old house in the American South, and we would get cockroaches in my room like once or twice a week in the summers. I can't stand the things to this day, and they'd scurry behind dressers and into closets just like the cat did in the movie. This scene captured that feeling for me perfectly. This is a good example of where a lot of the charm of this movie comes from, blending horror and farce together in really creative ways. It takes the original story and plays up how silly our two main characters are, trying over and over again to bring the dead back to life and having things go more and more awry each time. This is likely because zombies and mad scientists were much more well known in the 80s than they were in the 20s. Playing the original story completely straight probably wouldn't feel very interesting. So they decided to up the horror stakes a bit by adding two key characters. Megan, who is the daughter of the medical school's dean as well as Dan's girlfriend, and Dr. Hill, a professor at the university who teaches West and Dan. Dr. Hill serves as someone for West and Dan to butt heads with, and he also is completely obsessed with Megan. Poor Megan. The addition of her character gives us what I see as the real horror that this film is communicating. And that is the horror of being a woman in a world run by men. Seriously, her character has nothing but misfortune happen to her at almost no fault of her own. The only thing she's guilty of is having bad taste in men. Outside of that, she's right about everything in the movie. She knows West is bad news right off the bat, and once she finds out about his experiments, she urges Dan to kick him out. Like, yeah man, he killed your cat and brought it back to life. Why are you hanging out with him still? As the situation escalates, she is always the voice of reason and she is always ignored. This is the most noticeable when the dean kicks Dan out of school for working with West. All Dan has to do to stay in school is apologize to the dean and stop working with West. And Megan is the one trying to tell him that. As she argues with Dan, he is constantly pushing her away. During the whole scene, Megan is fighting to even be in the shot, emphasizing how little control she has over the situation. She's at the mercy of the decisions of her fiancé and her father. There is no blood and gore in this scene, but it's still pretty horrifying. The horror continues for her and everyone else when Dan and West end up killing her father. The scene starts out actually pretty comical. They sneak into the morgue to reanimate a fresh body, and when they do, things turn into a farce almost immediately. The guy they reanimate is very angry and very strong, and they lose control of him right as the dean comes to catch them. Note that Megan was pleading for him to leave Dan alone. So, the zombie breaks out, squishes the dean with the door, and proceeds to maul him to death. West manages to kill the zombie with a bone cutter, but he is too late to save the dean. But West notices that the dean's body is still largely intact, and he would be the freshest possible specimen. So, sure enough, he reanimates the dean. And the dean is doing not great. He mostly just cowers and wails now. The dean's reanimation captures a lot of the horror from the original text. The way he jumps from violent rage to confused fear lets the viewer imagine what the dean saw after death. and how horrible his new half-life really is. Anyway, West manages to talk his way out of the situation again, and Dr. Hill takes custody of the Dean in a personal jail cell in his office. Through experimenting on the Dean, Dr. Hill discovers that West has been somewhat successful with his reanimation serum. So Hill decides that he wants the credit for himself. He tries to blackmail West, so West decapitates him with a shovel. Fair enough. Always consistent, West reanimates Dr. Hill's body and head separately. And then we find out that Dr. Hill's head can still control his body from across the room. So he knocks West out, picks up the serum and his own head, and stumbles away to the university. This movie is amazing. While this is happening, Megan and Dan sneak into Dr. Hill's office and discover that the doctor has a creepy stalker folder about Megan, including but not limited to a lock of her hair. Yeah, here is where the theme of obsession really collides with the horror of being a woman that I talked about earlier. Dr. Hill's obsession with medical prestige, now focused on perfecting West's serum, is only outweighed by his obsession with Megan. That takes us to maybe the funniest scene in the movie, where Dr. Hill's headless body flops around his office for a while and starts to mind control the Dean. I'll get to that. We realize that Dr. Hill's plan includes going out of his way to kidnap Megan. Okay, well, he sends the Dean to do it, but whatever.
I wanted so much to hate you.
Megan's no good, very bad day continues with one of the most uncomfortable scenes I have ever witnessed, where Dr. Hill, holding his own head, begins to assault Megan in the morgue. When I first saw it, I thought it was only there to shock you or gross you out, which it certainly does. But the scene is also driving the movie's themes home. Luckily, Dan and Wes stop Dr. Hill in the act. Here is where Dr. Hill reveals that he is able to control reanimated corpses with a lobotomy-like procedure that he'd been working on. Dr. Hill's character is an adapted version of the leader of the zombie army that kills West at the end of the written story. Once again, shit hits the fan in the morgue when Dr. Hill raises his zombie army and they start flailing around and attacking our still mortal trio. Unfortunately, West doesn't make it. He tries killing Dr. Hill with an overdose of the serum, which works, but also causes the corpse to strangle West to death with tentacles made out of intestines. Anyway, Dan and Megan begin to escape, but are caught in the elevator at the last minute by a zombie. Dan manages to kill it, but not before it kills Megan. And to really put a cherry on top, our movie ends with Dan injecting Megan's corpse with the reanimation serum, cutting to black with the sound of undead Megan's screams. Yeah, even in death, she couldn't get her fiancé to listen to her. I suppose I should clarify that I don't know for certain what the creators were going for when it comes to Megan's character. Or any character, really. I couldn't find any interview with Stuart Gordon breaking down this film. Most filmmakers don't do that anyway, either because they want their art to speak for itself, or just because they don't feel like it. Point being, it's totally possible that the characters of this film didn't think once about Megan's depiction through a feminist lens, which is fine. Well, okay, maybe they could have considered it, but not every movie has to drill down into the oppression of each of its characters. That would be pretty exhausting. Their goal with this movie could have just been, we're gonna make a fun zombie movie. But really, if one of the strongest metaphors I've seen for a woman being harmed by patriarchy was written by accident, I feel like that only drives my point home more. But if I was a betting man, I would put money on it being intentional. The way Megan is framed feels purposeful, and they even include some foreshadowing when her and Dan are joking around.
Stop! Don't! Dan, stop it!
My pretty.
Dan, I don't like that. Don't!
Ah, there's not a jury in the world
Stop!
that would convict me. Dr. Dan.
The obsession with reanimation from Lovecraft's story blends really well with Dr. Hill's obsession with Megan. Both obsessions push a positive desire, I don't want people to die, or I love Megan, into a dark, objectifying place. Both Megan and the corpses are treated like objects to be controlled and owned. So if it wasn't already clear, I think this movie is wonderful. It takes everything I like about the original story, tosses out all the bad stuff, and manages to incorporate new elements that make the experience more interesting. I feel like adding new characters in a film adaptation can be pretty risky, but Reanimator manages to use its additions to deliver horror that feels really modern. Women have pretty much always been treated as second-class citizens, but people were at least becoming aware that that was a problem in the 1980s. Bringing that horror to the screen is not only a political statement, but in this case, it is a direct reflection of the experiences of roughly half the audience. Other sources of horror match the time as well. The fear of technology drastically changing the world is just as present here as it was in the 20s. This was the decade where the personal computer was entering homes, leading to all kinds of nonsense. And it isn't lost on me that in the middle of the AIDS crisis, our bad guys are both in the medical field and there's an abundance of shared needles. It all comes together really nicely, or morbidly, I guess. And that's without ever really getting into the practical effects, but I feel like with the clips you've seen so far, you've seen how much fun they can be. If you're a Lovecraft fan or just interested in an offbeat horror movie, then I can't recommend Reanimator enough. Thanks for watching!